Hello. It's rather lovely to see you on this rather autumnal day, beginning of October. Welcome along to my 79th episode of Adventures in Pop. And, now that you're here, we can get started. I'm going to be talking not about my own music today, or Goldhawk Foxes, or Rothman and Jacobs, my other projects. So today I'm going to be talking about, Ed Sheeran very briefly, but mostly about David Bowie. Hello. Yes, I went to see the Bowie film Moonage Daydream. As I'm sure you know, all Bowie fans will be aware, this has been out on general release for about a week. I'm going to start with a very brief point about Ed Sheeran, and then we'll get into a little bit about, my critique of the Bowie film. Oh, and I'll be really careful. I won't give away too much. You might not have seen the film. If you want to know absolutely nothing about the film, I think actually you might want to skip this whole adventure, but I'll be really careful. Whatever I say about the film, I cannot give you any kind of, I can't give you any warning about just, the visual impact of it at all. So, you should still go and see it, but I'll try not to give too much away. Let's start with Ed Sheeran. This is brief, but it's a little bit sad, actually. You remember a little while ago, we talked in one of these adventures about Ed Sheeran's problems with having copyright claims made against him, and there was a case in the UK that he won about 6 months ago, and he was at pains at that point to point out, that it's too easy for people to bring copyright claims against another artist when you consider, I think he mentioned at that time, there are only 12 notes available to us. And when you think about the number of people who are putting music together, uploading music to Spotify, just that, this the pure volume of tracks that get uploaded to Spotify, there's bound to be some crossover. There's bound to be a couple of songs you could find somewhere in there that sounds a bit like this. Maybe they've, taken a tiny bit of lyric from over here. Well, have they taken it, or have they even heard that to be influenced, et cetera, et cetera. So look, it's a complicated subject. But now this week in America, he is to face another trial over claims that he copied Marvin Gaye's "Let's Get It On." Now this is not about his song "Shape of You," which was what concerned his trial in the UK. This is about "Thinking Out Loud," which I think came out in 2014. And I've got a little bit from the Telegraph actually here, which just very neatly lays out the sort of the basics. It says that, yes, Sheeran released a single "Thinking Out Loud" in 2014, but in 2018 a claim was lodged by a US company which partly owns the rights to Gaye's 1973 hit "Let's Get It On," claiming £90 million of damages. Wow. So a judge in the US has ordered that Sheeran needs to face a trial over claims he copied the song "Let's Get It On" by Marvin Gaye, in a decision which comes just 6 months after the British pop star was cleared of copyright claims for another of his tracks following a UK hearing. Sheeran has attempted to have the latest copyright case against him dismissed, but a US judge said that a jury must decide whether he copied it or not. That in itself is problematic, because I think most people in juries don't really understand stuff about, chord sequences and that, the kind of musical structure that it is claimed that he might have copied. But, nevertheless, that's what's happening. The claim that he did copy the song has been made not by Gaye's family, but by a company owned by an investment banker who owns part of the copyright. Oh my goodness, how complicated is that? Well, I think I wish Ed Sheeran, not my favourite artist by any means, but I wish him the best of luck with this, because I think he is being targeted. And maybe he's being targeted because a lot of his songs are very kind of universal. They are the kind of song, when you hear it, you think, oh, I must have known that for years, because they're kind of simple and they get in your ear. That's what makes him so successful. But the thing that makes him so successful is the problem, because his songs are very universal. You could probably listen to an Ed Sheeran song and find something else that is a bit similar, because that is what he does. And I don't think he should be pilloried for that, actually. I think if people like it, then people like it, and I can't complain about that, and I don't. So, good luck, Ed. That's not good. So let's talk about the Bowie film I went to see yesterday. It's called Moonage Daydream. It is a documentary, and it's a really interesting documentary because it doesn't sort of do the thing that many documentaries will do, which is to kind of work in a rather linear fashion through somebody's life in chronological order, saying they did this and then they did this and then guess what, they did this. Instead, this is more like a collage of music and imagery, that you just kind of wallow in for a couple of hours, and it does take you through some kind of chronology, but it's not it's not completely linear. It pops back and forth, and there are some repeated bits of imagery that pop up on screen, more than once, maybe even more than twice. And okay, so first thing I'd say is the sound quality is fantastic. There are tracks I think have been remixed for this documentary, and so you're hearing some Bowie classics in a way that you've probably never heard them before, and I think that's quite exciting, and they do sound great. I think whatever cinema you go to see this, you're going to be impressed by the sheer quality of the sound. I think maybe the number one thing that makes this documentary a real standout is that it is being narrated, so to speak, by Bowie himself. So the director has managed to find enough of Bowie talking about himself, about his life, about his progress, about his concerns and crises and highs and lows. He's found enough of that footage that we are left just with Bowie's account of Bowie's life, and it's really interesting because Bowie is obviously he's rather well placed, I suppose, to comment on his own life and ups and downs of his career and his kind of search for artistic creativity. I think. I mean, I we'll come back to that point, but also David Bowie's occasionally quite an unreliable witness. He does contradict himself. There are kind of a few elements where he says one thing and then a little bit later he is saying or doing the exact opposite. And I don't think that's a criticism. I think it's interesting. I think when Bowie is talking, I think he's being sincere. And then sometimes he changes his mind and thinks, no, I think maybe I was wrong about that, and I now think this. So that's quite interesting. We are witness to Bowie himself developing and kind of transforming from the first time we see him, around Space Oddity or around particularly Ziggy Stardust era, right through to, kind of into the 90s. So, we over that period of time, we do see him really change as a person. And that's really interesting. Okay, I think for me, what I liked the most out for this film is the concert footage, which is, of course, often glorious. I mean, really fabulous, and you kind of get a sense of just how vast some of the crowds are that he was performing to, and the kind of impact he was having on people. And I really enjoyed also the interview footage, and you see him being interviewed in the early days, often by Russell Harty. One particular interview where he's literally come into the studio dressed as Ziggy, and quite a sight, and talks about his. Well, he's being asked. I mean, I don't think he actually gives much of an answer, but he's being asked about his bisexuality, which is all kind of quite fun and a little bit quaint in retrospect, but is interesting nonetheless. So just seeing the way that Bowie responds to interviews is one of the things that really changes across the whole of this period, over 20, 30 years, as it probably would do. He's getting older, more mature, and more confident. And actually, what you see is early Bowie, evasive, amusing. I mean, quite funny with the questions, but never really giving a straight answer. Through to much more sincere, straight talking. Giving eye contact to the interviewer in the later stages, somebody who's much more comfortable in their own skin and knows what he's doing. So a very different Bowie, 10, 15, 20 years later. as you may expect, really. Um, I guess the other really strong point that comes out of this film is Bowie's preoccupation with being an artist. You know, nothing is allowed to get in his way of being an artist. He is an artist first and foremost, and it's not just about musical creativity. It's about you know, painting. It's about, you know, different types of music. It's about you know, movement and mime and dancing, and so, you know, he is absolutely curious and, you know, investigative at all times because he wants to be an artist, and he's concerned about his development as an artist. You know, I would say obsessed with his development as an artist. So he doesn't want to fall in love with somebody. And he doesn't want to get too comfortable. He wants to change his location. He wants to give himself something that is going to get him out of his comfort zone and force him to write better music, write music in a different way. So we see a couple of examples of that. So again, I won't give too much away, but there are a couple of brilliant bits. One is he says, "I've always hated LA, so I went to live there for 2 years," and, you know, that was his way of trying to demonstrate that he would like to, you know, be in an uncomfortable place because it would make his songwriting better. It would make his artistic creativity all the better. And then, of course, there is his move to Berlin, which, you know, people know about towards the latter part of the 70s when he moved to Berlin. And he went there because he needed a change of scenery. He wanted to go somewhere that was off the beaten track, but also where things were really happening, things were changing, things were interesting. And, you know, Berlin certainly fitted the bill for that. But when he got to Berlin, he needed help. He said he needed to try and reinvent the way that he was approaching writing. He wanted to kind of break it down and start again. So there's a really nice bit where he says, you know, he called Brian Eno, and he basically says, you know, if Brian Eno hadn't been able to help him, he would have just stopped. You know, basically he desperately needed some input from somebody that he obviously respected and admired to come and get things started. And then there's almost like a bit of a surprise that he ends up with stuff that, you know, is good enough to make an album and several albums. You know, we're talking about Low and Heroes and even Lodger, which doesn't really get a mention. But, you know, those are the great Berlin albums. And, you know, he almost seems a bit surprised that he's been able to put those albums out. So he talks a lot about, you know, artistic creativity being about, you know, needing to be a little bit out of your depth, and he describes the, you know, almost his metaphor is being, you know, swimming, is being in water, and he says when you are literally not able to touch the bottom, that's when, you know, artistic creativity can really flourish. If you can touch the bottom, then you're probably too comfortable. Really interesting. I you know, I was as somebody who was also kind of interested in the process of writing songs. I mean, I found all that stuff really fascinating. So what you see is you know, somebody on this constant search for self-development, self-improvement, and I think initially to actually just to find himself. You know, he is all these different characters, and he does get asked about, you know, are his characters a way of hiding from people, or are they? Is he expressing himself? You know, and I think he says something around, you know, it is about hiding, but at the same time he's having great fun. He's enjoying being these different characters, and using these different viewpoints to, you know, to be able to come up with music. Okay, I would say disappointing for me was not much attention given to maybe my favourite Bowie albums, which are kind of right mid-70s, like Station to Station and Young Americans. They get short shrift actually on this film, but, you know, that's a small side point really. And as I say, you know, we watch him transform from, you know, nervous and evasive to being incredibly relaxed and confident. And, you know, obviously there's a chunk that concerns itself with Let's Dance and the Serious Moonlight tour, which obviously, you know, was when he kind of went big. And there's quite a lot of discussion about the ups and downs of going big. Goes back to my point about contradicting himself. At one point he says, you know, absolutely this is the right thing to do. Later on he says, there was no growth, no development there, and you know he had to kind of go back a bit and start looking for himself again. So plenty in this film to get your teeth into. I hope I haven't given too much away. It's quite a long film, so I think in a few minutes I can barely scratch the surface of Moonage Daydream by David Bowie. So if you're a Bowie fan, or if you think you might just be a Bowie fan, or you've just sort of vaguely heard of him, go and see it. It's really good. It will tell you a lot about about one of the most interesting and influential artists that this country has ever produced, really bar none. And the 70s was his decade. And we talk a lot about being able to come up with different images, different styles from one album to the next. But he made that kind of constant transformation his own in the 1970s. I think really before anybody else, and it was extraordinary when you think of the different albums he came up with in that time. I mean, it was an album every 9 months roughly, and each one would be completely different from the one before, and until he got to Berlin, and then he settles into a bit more of a pattern. But then he changes again for Scary Monsters, and again for Let's Dance. I'm going to leave it there. So look, go and see it. But now, look, for me, next week, I've got a new single coming out next Friday. So I'll be back during the week to tell you all about that. It's marvellous, and you will need to be listening to that. But I'll be back during the week to give you the full lowdown on my new record. Until then, have a fabulous rest of the weekend, and you take care in the October sunshine, and I will talk to you soon. Bye-bye.